in a completely different universe from the one we were inhabiting when you got in touch.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, so much can change in 2 weeks. And I was just looking back of my calendar over the last 4 weeks. It's unbelievable how much things can shift.
And yet, arguably, anyone hoping for clarity is still confounded.
Yes. I continue to believe very strongly that there is a sane, pragmatic middle ground here, and that we don't have to be forced into alienating half the country by lurching for hard Brexit or going back into the European Union, that there must be a way of bringing people together. But I must admit my faith gets a bit tested sometimes.
Oh, does it? Crikey. Well, we've already got off to a very interesting start, because I think it's about, if I've understood you correctly, it's about gradations of alienation. So you talk about trying to avoid alienating half of the country. As I see it, Theresa May's deal alienates all of the country, but nowhere near as much as they would be alienated if they were in the alienated half.
Right. Well, I suppose maybe an analogy might be that a nation is like a family, possibly, or like a community, that if you have very, very strongly polarized views and you have to live together for the next 10, 20 years, you've got to try to find a common ground. And the thing that worries me a little bit, and this is obvious on social media, is that both sides at the moment are claiming a monopoly of speaking for the people. It's a very dangerous thing in politics.
Yes, it is.
And it's also true that neither side seems to want to listen to the other or actually give them any kind of legitimacy. So one side is described as the elite, the other side is told that they didn't understand what they were doing. We have to, I think, because this isn't just a general election, maybe you could have a small majority for one side or another and you could go quite radical, because that would only last for a few years. But our settlement with Europe is the next 20, 30, 40 years of our country. So that has to try to bring the country with it. And we have to try to feel our way towards what kind of relationship Britain wants with Europe.
I recognise some of what you say, and obviously the divisions that you describe are familiar to everybody. But what we've done on this programme is sort of rise above the fray a bit and focus instead upon the key players. So you're quite right. If you immerse yourself in social media, then the depictions of an elite on one side and a misled mass on the other hold and hurt. But and you're a Conservative minister. You see people like Esther McVey claiming that there can be a transition period in the event of a no-deal Brexit, something that is factually false. You see Liam Fox today celebrating the trade deal that the European Union has signed with Japan, despite being one of the architects of our decision to walk away from the European Union. You hear your more junior colleagues like Andrew Bridgen claiming that he can get an Irish passport by dint of being an Englishman. I don't think you're in the ERG's WhatsApp group, but you're aware of Nadine Dorries using it to ask people to tell her what the customs union is, because she is repeatedly losing arguments about why it's the right thing to leave the customs union. And it doesn't end there. You've got Ian Duncan Smith, a former leader of your party, effectively arguing that he can solve this problem, but he just can't tell us how. Owen Paterson, a former Northern Ireland secretary, who along with Theresa Villiers doesn't seem to have read the Good Friday Agreement. That's not telling ordinary voters that they've been misled. That's telling the cheerleaders of this movement that they don't understand the issues that they're charged with delivering.
Well, James, obviously that's quite a sorry tale you've just produced there.
That's your party.
And
your
right.
Government.
Yeah, and you're right, James, in a lot of what you say. But let me just try to reframe this, which is that it's probably true that many, many people are confused. Politicians are confused. I think a lot of the public is confused. I had a Regis professor from Cambridge say to me that she just worked out what the difference was between the customs union and the single market 2 weeks ago, and she's on the Remain side.
Yes.
So it is a really contested, fractious world, this. And obviously I'm trying to focus on the details of the deal. So I'm trying to focus on quotas, I'm trying to focus on rules of origin, tariffs. But of course what I'm learning is that isn't really what this is about. And what you're pointing to with all those quotes from politicians is that there's something very visceral and emotional going on here. We have to try to take people away from their emotional attachment. That's true even for my friends who are Remainers. I mean, many of them too don't necessarily understand all the detail of this. They just feel very, very strongly emotionally tied to Europe, and they feel very strongly against the people who voted for Brexit. But the long-term thing, James, if I can be a little pompous for a second.
Of course, you're in good company.
Is that I guess Britain has had a difficult, ambivalent relationship with Europe for 50 years. We need to now work out what kind of country we want to be. We need to work out what kind of foreign policy we want, what kind of trade policy we want. And I think the place to do it is by leaving the political institutions of the EU, but remaining very, very closely connected, economically, politically, because Europe is changing too. So you need to look at Europe over the next 5-10 years. Europe is going to have inner circles, outer circles. Norway, Switzerland are moving. It's actually pretty impolite in a way for Britain to sit in the middle of the European Union while it goes through this national midlife crisis. I think it would be better for us to position ourselves close to Europe but outside while we work out what we want.
Why?
Because inside the European Union, our position will always be, unfortunately, because of the referendum, fragile.
So this is I think I'm understanding. I was looking forward to meeting you, Rory Stewart, because I wanted to sign up to your brand of optimism, but I think I'm better seeing your rationale for this brand of optimism, which is it's not the best course, but it's not as bad as that course. And that's why I focus upon the comments of some of your colleagues, because I don't like the equivalence that you bring to the two sides. On one side, people are still telling demonstrable untruths. They're still displaying epic ignorance of the most important issues of this whole debate. They are, I'm afraid. That's just a matter of record and a matter of fact. On the other side, people possibly may have exaggerated or embellished predictions, but they haven't engaged in criminality and illegality, and they haven't been caught lying. They haven't been caught with their pants down. And what you're saying is we need to do something that will unite the two sides. Since when did we become a country where cheats prosper?
Well, I'm finding that I'm getting extraordinary abuse, not just from Brexiteers, but also for Remainers. I just had a Remainer calling me a belittling shit. I've just had a Remainer saying that I should be
I think we may have had to dump your last comment on the grounds of Ofcom rules, but anyone familiar with my Twitter feed will be perfectly familiar with the language that Rory employed.
I just had a Remainer saying that I should be first against the wall. I've had Remainers trying to compare me to an appeaser. So I don't think either side here has a monopoly on virtue.
You're being disingenuous a little, because I'm not talking about people calling you names on social media. I'm talking about the fundamental facts of the Remain position being legal and evidence-based, and the fundamental facts of the Leave position now, and this wasn't necessarily true 2 years ago, but we now know it is illegal and it is fantasy-based. And to try to draw... I admire you enormously for trying to plot a middle ground on this, but it's false equivalence that led us into this mess, and doubling down on false equivalence seems an unlikely way out of it.
James, I don't want to be tempted into slagging off Remainers and Brexiteers when I'm trying to bring people together.
Well, that's kind of my point as well, is that you can't treat them equally, because one side cheated and one side didn't.
I really, if you're trying to bring people together, trying to ascribe blame in both directions doesn't make sense. But obviously, if I were a Brexiteer, I would say that some of the Remain claims during the referendum about the economic impacts of immediate departure turned out not to be true either. If I was a Brexiteer, I would point out that some of the arguments that Remainers are making against the referendum, yes, some of them are legal, but some of them sound a little bit like the kinds of arguments that were made against female suffrage in the early 20th century. So I don't want to get dragged into this.
Okay, we can let that pass.
Let's come back to what I hope that we are going to get towards, which is an understanding that if you were to have a second referendum, and if you were to narrowly vote to rejoin the European Union, you would be rejoining the European Union with a third referendum campaign starting immediately, with a new BNP, with a new UK Independence Party, and you would be coming back, as it were, halfway through the divorce proceedings, back into the family home, trying to reassert your old position in Europe, and the Europeans and international investors looking at you saying, we can see what's happening on the British streets, how long are you going to be here? And when you began to try to assert British positions in the way that we have for the last 40 years, quite understandably, the French or the Germans would probably be tempted to turn around and say, wait a second,
this is really
you've
interesting.
half-wrecked our club,
you think we'd be weakened by remaining as a kind of, because all eyes would be focused on the rail track, on what might be further down the rail track. In other words, you describe a country that has become utterly untrustworthy.
I think I'm saying that a lot changed with that referendum, and you can't pretend that rejoining or remaining in the European Union now would be the same as if the referendum hadn't happened. It completely erodes our soft power in Europe, it erodes our influence in Europe, and it would make it very, very difficult indeed for Britain to continue to be in Europe the way that it had been before the referendum, even if you were able to pull off that vote.
I understand that. I don't, knowing what I know of your previous career, both in politics and not in politics, I've never noticed you before as being a man who would duck a challenge because it was very, very difficult.
I'm not
quite the opposite, Rory Stewart.
No. I think that what I would try to explain to European colleagues and to people in Britain is that given all the pain that has come out of this referendum, the best thing for us to do, and this is partly out of respect for Europe, is to withdraw from the political institutions of the European Union and then work out ourselves as a country what kind of relationship we want going forward. And that is a decision that we have to make outside the European Union, because the European Union isn't going to negotiate with a member state, obviously, and they've made that clear from the beginning.
And yet still some of your colleagues are in apparent denial of what you rightly describe as a simple fact. Also, we're going to take a quick break now, but also you seem to be, at least in the short term, casting us in the role of what they call rule taker, not rule maker. But we'll come back to that imminently. A tweet from Jacob. Who is this on LBC right now with you, James? He sounds like a voice of reason to me. It's Rory Stewart, the Prisons Minister, and latterly the sort of Jeff Boycott of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, the minister who has put in more hours at the crease defending it than any other. I would also refer you to a tweet from Gary, who reminds us, Rory Stewart, that there is a moratorium on the use of the word Brexiteer on this programme. We'd be grateful if you could observe that, because it affords them a romance that is ill-deserved. I get it. I don't agree with you. I don't imagine anyone was expecting us to leave this interview in full concord, but you, I think, sincerely believe that all the other options are worse than this one. And that is a really odd position to find yourself in as a politician, because you're supposed to be promising jam tomorrow and sunny uplands and all of the things that we've heard now for 2.5 years. But what you're really saying is we are so riven, we are so broken, that the only way we can start moving towards mending is by letting neither side win.
And I think that's right. And I think it's also why instinctively still the majority of people in Parliament want a Brexit deal. I mean, there are, of course, some who want a second referendum and remain. There are some who want no deal at all. But the majority is still in the position of wanting a Brexit deal. And the frustrating thing for me, I suppose that nobody can agree on what that deal feels like. But all these deals, it doesn't matter whether it's Jeremy Corbyn's deal or it's the Prime Minister's deal, are actually very, very similar types of deal. The problem is that we seem to be unable to get people to focus on the details. They're still playing to constituencies, and we've got to move it from the politics of playing constituencies to focusing on a 500-page text.
That is, in a sense, the historian speaking as well, I think, isn't it? I mean, you I like this line about neither side can win if we are to heal, and in fact, in the context of civil wars, for people who don't know, you're an Afghanistan expert. In the context of internecine warfare, until the mutual interest becomes compromised, it is mutually assured destruction.
And obviously, this is not a violence of war. In fact, in many ways, one of the striking things is, given how strongly people disagree, is how stable and peaceful Britain remains. But the truth you've got there is right, that one of the things that keeps these kinds of disputes going is that there will always be politicians and constituencies who get rewarded by their core voters for not compromising, and who will never feel that there's any interest in getting towards a deal. And the deal that comes in the end can always be presented as the worst of all worlds, when in fact it's probably the best of all worlds.
Or the least bad of all worlds.
Or the least bad of all worlds. And let me also explain why it's not so bad. It's not so bad because, in fact, it positions Britain well to think about the next 10 or 20 years in terms of not just its economy, but its diplomacy. We need to think through, what is our position going to be on Russia? What's our position going to be on Turkey? What's our position going to be on the United States or China or the Western Balkans? There are some very complicated decisions we need to make about what kind of environmental regulations we want, what kind of trading relations we want, what kind of foreign service we want. all these things, it isn't a bad position to be in, to remain very, very closely tied into the European markets, vital for our car industry, vital for our economy, while also having the space to try to work through much more fundamental issues which are about identity. These issues of immigration are not just economic issues, they're social, cultural issues that we're going to have to work our way through.
But the engine of Brexit, the engine of leaving, was the opposite of what you've just described. This rule taker, not rule maker paradigm is one which I suppose if I were you, I'd be pointing out the harm that I'm causing the other side to this side. So I'd say to the leaver, yes, but look, the Remainers not going to have this, or this. And I'd say to the Remainer, yes, but look, the Leaver's not going to have their mythical sovereignty or their rule maker status enhanced. You're doing an exercise, if I've understood it, and I've watched you quite closely over the last couple of weeks. You're really an architect of damage limitation.
More than that, I think, because I think that actually this deal, if it manages to keep us linked into the European single markets, protect our car industry and our automobile industry, and deliver that key Brexit demand, which was to get control over immigration.
But he can't do that, though. We can't retain customs union single market quasi-membership while abolishing freedom of movement. And I suspect you're on a rather different page from the Prime Minister when it comes to the prioritisation of abolishing freedom of movement. You don't see that as an unalloyed joy and victory.
James, you're right that we cannot completely have our cake and eat it, and this is one of the ways in which I disagree with the way in which Boris has framed this. There are going to have to be very difficult choices, and if Britain chooses to put very strong controls on immigration, that will almost certainly, and also decides to go away for environmental regulations, social regulations, that will have an impact on our trade with Europe. And on the other hand, if you want it completely unimpeded, single market access, customs union access, then you'd have to compromise on the other things. But that's exactly the space we need to be in as Britain. We need to be talking about those kinds of details. We need to be saying, here is this car factory, this is exactly what it's selling, this is the tariff or quota we want, this is the immigration number we want, rather than leaving it at this very general story about Europe or Britain. Those generic abstractions are not really what's about, it's about the details. And I think it is still possible to have a smart, moderate deal where we remain close to Europe but outside Europe. And I think that European leaders understand that that's where we're going and that's what this deal is. In many ways, they're being sincere when they say this is a good deal and that they gave us more than they felt they were going to give us. They felt the Prime Minister negotiated hard. And they're acknowledging that they made some concessions.
You know that tomorrow's newspapers are going to tell the opposite story to that. They're going to be saying that because what Theresa May has done is negotiate hard, win some ground from the other leaders, and then she's been sent back by your party to demand more, and she's been sent back with her tail between her legs, which means that in tomorrow's newspapers it will be cast as the EU bullying her. But we'll wait and see on that. Before you go, if the agreement doesn't get through Parliament, what's the plan B?
Well, I fear that we just have to keep, from my point of view, finding our way towards a middle ground deal. I don't think that no deal or no Brexit can be the long-term answer for Britain, given 50 years of a problematic relationship. The only way that we're going to work through this is close to Europe, but not in the political institutions of the European Union, so it will be something like this deal.
Rory Stewart, it's been a pleasure. Are you going to give yourself an extension on the pledge to the 12-month limit you put on reducing the amount, because you've been so busy with other stuff? I think in the circumstances that would be allowed.
James is very kind, but I will repeat that I will resign in August if I do not succeed in reducing the violence.
Well, you're having a bit of an essay crisis at the minute, aren't you?